Hello and welcome to part 2 of our adventure through the games developed by Jeppe Carlsen. Last time we took a look at a game called 140, and this time we're taking a look at his newest game, at least at the time of recording this video, THOTH. As I mentioned in the previous video, this game marks quite a departure from the gameplay of the last game we covered, so let's dive into it. Unlike 140, THOTH is a top-down twin-stick shooter, yet another one of my favourite genres which is often neglected in today's game libraries. It shares similarities with 140 in certain ways, most notably in its art direction, again being very minimal, using nothing but basic shapes in its presentation. However, pretty much everything else about the game is totally different from 140. Gone is the upbeat progressive electronic soundtrack, and in its place is an ambient, very laid-back soundscape, which I would say is probably the most divisive thing about the game. On the one hand, it gives THOTH a really unique atmosphere because it's not normally the sort of thing you hear while playing a fast-paced shooter like this, but on the other hand, it could also be perceived as a bit disjointed for this same reason. Almost like the music doesn't match what's happening on screen. Personally though, I really liked this, because it breaks standard conventions and gives the game a very distinct personality. Just like 140, THOTH doesn't have a conventional story, and it's all about the gameplay. Again, in a similar fashion to 140, the game does have some abstract imagery used in its ending sequence, which gives the implication of a greater meaning, but I think this is more so used to make it clear you've finished the game and give you a sense of completion. I do enjoy coming up with ideas about what's going on though and creating my own story for the game, even if that wasn't the intention. The minimal control scheme of 140 also makes its return here, again only having two control functions. But this time, instead of being moving and jumping, it's moving and shooting, which are done with the left and right analog sticks. Things are slightly more complicated here though, because you'll move a bit faster if you stop shooting, which is essential to make use of to dodge out of the way of enemies and the projectiles. So while the gameplay is about as simple as it gets, featuring no power-ups or anything like that, this balance of offensive and defensive gameplay gives the game just enough of a tactical element to be really engaging. The overall objective of the game and the way it's structured I find really interesting, because instead of making your way forward through levels and not knowing when the game will end or how many levels there are, THOTH immediately tells you how many levels there are in the game and has you work backwards, starting at level 64 and working your way to level 1. I feel like this creates a situation where you're supposed to complete this game in one sitting. After all, it's not very long, and always knowing exactly how far away you are from the end of the game gives you more of an incentive to complete it. This actually makes it perfect for the Switch, being able to pick it up and play it portably for a bit and finish the whole thing just to kill a bit of time. You know, sometimes when I'm making these videos, I overanalyze the way that I'm pronouncing certain words, but here, I'm genuinely curious as to how you're supposed to say the name of this game. Obviously I've been calling it THOTH, but maybe it's supposed to be THOTH? And I was calling 140 140, and maybe it's supposed to be 140 or 140? I don't know, maybe I've been butchering the names of these games without even realising. The way the game works is that you need to clear each level of all of the enemies by shooting them and turning them into voids of space. The gimmick here though is that even after the enemies have been defeated and become these voids, they'll still be coming after you and remain a threat. So the only way to escape them is by killing every single enemy and moving on to the next level. It's a pretty interesting idea and somewhat reminds me of the game Asteroids, where even after blowing up the asteroids, they remain a threat because they explode into smaller pieces of rock and they can still destroy you. This isn't the only interesting concept here though, because there's also quite a variety of different enemy types you'll be coming across, which each need to be prioritised in different ways, as well as a ton of obstacles which will make situations more difficult too. For example, we have the standard enemies, which are these squares that simply lock onto you and slowly move towards you. There's these moving walls of dots which kill you if they touch you. Squares which shoot out a smaller projectile when they're defeated or take a certain amount of damage. There's gates which open and close when you kill an enemy. There's circle enemies which begin getting bigger and take up the whole screen, but then get smaller when they're shot. These are particularly clever because if you kill them and turn them into a void, you can no longer shoot them, but they still get bigger, meaning that you could make things extremely difficult if you kill these first. So it might be better to save those for last. Then we have another more complicated enemy with these circles that when destroyed let out a smaller circle, and with the next enemy defeated you actually become that smaller circle, effectively teleporting to its location, forcing you to think about not only keeping yourself safe, but also making sure the smaller circle is in a safe position before you kill any enemies. There's loads more enemies and obstacles on top of this, and because the game is really fast paced and has such a large amount of different enemies, things are kept really interesting and varied. Of course, with this amount of enemies comes the fact that sometimes many of these different varieties of enemy will be used together, creating situations that can be difficult to get past. Adding to the difficulty of the game is the fact that you only have 2 attempts to get past levels, and if you don't manage to do it, you'll be forced back to the previous checkpoint. The checkpoints occur after completing 4 levels, so there's 64 levels, and if you die on level 61 twice in a row, you'll go back to level 64. But if you reach level 60, then you've banked your progress up until that point. This gives the game tension because you don't want to lose progress, but it's also not too harsh, and makes you better at the game through repeating the same levels if you're stuck. What I will say though is that I personally didn't find the game to be that difficult. I imagine that people that haven't played a game like this before would have trouble, but if you're at all familiar with twin stick shooters or bullet hell style games, THOTH is nothing to sweat too much over. It's still really fun and a bit of a challenge, don't get me wrong, but if you're looking for something to really test even an experienced player, this isn't too difficult. One aspect of the game that I actually found a bit weird is that when you die a single time on a level, on your second attempt the border around the level and any walls within the level become instant death blocks, whereas normally on your first attempt the walls and edges are safe to touch. This is strange because it technically makes the game more difficult if you die, and you would think it would be the other way around if anything. Still, it does make you focus a lot more and adds even more pressure, and maybe that was the point. At this point we've basically covered all of the major stuff the game has to offer, so let's now move on and talk about some of the extra content the game has in store for us. Remember how in my 140 review I said that pretty much one of the only negative things to say is that it doesn't have the biggest amount of replay value? Well, THOTH actually addresses that, and once you've beaten the normal mode and cleared the 64 levels, you unlock a harder difficulty where you need to clear 8 levels in a row, with an extra catch being that the levels are now randomised too. So not only do you need to clear more in a row, but you also can't practice them either. After clearing this mode you unlock an even harder version where you need to clear 12 levels in a row, then a mode where you need to beat the normal 64 levels but with no checkpoints. And then I assume there's a mode where you need to do 32 random levels in a row too. Maybe these 32 levels are designed to be significantly more difficult? I'm not sure. I'm currently on the 64 level mode, and as you can imagine, it's pretty tough doing the entire game without dying twice on the same level. And this mode is most likely where I'm going to be playing the game for the longest amount of time. But the reason I want to bring this up is because this gives the game pretty much infinite replay value, because you can pick it up and see how far you can get, and every single time you do so, you'll be seeing new levels in a new order to what you used to if you play on the randomised modes. It's almost like a high score mode, but instead of score, you just see how many levels you can complete. It's a brilliant addition, and it's where you'll be getting most of your game time from. It's easily the most addictive mode of the game, and without this, THOTH would have felt too short and just a bit lacking. One thing I'm a little bit disappointed by is that THOTH doesn't feature any specific boss levels. I'm not sure exactly how this would have worked, and maybe Jeppe Carlsen didn't want to follow a traditional game convention and break the gameplay up like that, which is fair enough with it being his creative vision obviously. But I think it could have been great to see how complicated and interesting he could tackle a boss battle in this genre. After all, the bosses in 140 were some of my favourite parts of the entire game. Now you might be thinking, surely that's it. I've covered the normal mode and the harder difficulties, and that's got to be it, right? But no, this game hasn't finished with us yet because it offers something that I kinda wish 140 would've. Multiplayer. Now, I don't want to come off as ungrateful here because it is genuinely awesome that there's a co-op multiplayer mode, and it's actually balanced really interestingly by having it so that when one player dies, they become a void and chase after the living player at a really high speed, becoming a real difficulty to dodge. But the reason it's necessary to balance the game like this and make it so the co-op doesn't give you an unfair advantage is because the multiplayer just consists of the same levels as the single player. It doesn't have its own specific levels or progression system or anything like that, which is slightly disappointing because I think there could have been some unique enemies or gimmicks used for the multiplayer. Like maybe forcing you to switch places in the middle of a shootout or something. There's also no competitive multiplayer, which again could have been done in a really interesting way. Maybe by not having you shoot each other directly, but turning enemies into your own coloured voids and having them go after your opponent or something. That would have been really original. But still, the multiplayer is really fun and adds another layer onto the gameplay, as well as giving you even more replay value too. So I suppose the thing you're supposed to do at the end of a multi-part review like this is compare all of the issues featured in the games we've talked about. The issue here is though, is that the games are so drastically different from each other that you can't really compare them in terms of gameplay. So I guess let's just talk about the general issues. I think 140's main problem is that it's short and lacking in replay value. But that's kind of an inescapable problem because it was designed as a short game. So to criticise it for being short seems counterintuitive to the design itself. I do think a boss rush mode would have been nice though. I mean, the bosses are already there, so in theory that would have been reasonably simple to implement. I also think that a multiplayer mode could have been interesting to see too. THOTH meanwhile is also short, but offers way more replay value in its harder difficulty modes and by having multiplayer. So it basically feels like my problems with 140 have been completely covered by THOTH. But with it having more content, it kind of opens itself up to having more flaws. And I feel bad saying it because it's a feature that I really like and wouldn't want to be absent, but the multiplayer could have been a lot better than what it is. It could have had its own levels and a competitive mode, or at the very least it could have had its own separate progression screen, because as it stands, if you finish it on single player and then switch to multiplayer, all of the levels are already registered as complete, whereas I think for it to do that, you should have had to finish them on multiplayer as well. Other than that though, I've got genuinely nothing negative to say about the game. I mean, you could say that it's not got that many levels, but it's got the infinite mode that basically gives you unlimited levels, and you could say that the sound design and music being eerie doesn't really suit the style of the game, but that's subjective and I actually really like that aspect of it. I'm giving THOTH a 9 out of 10. Just like 140, it's almost perfect in terms of what it's trying to achieve. It's incredibly short, which would turn a lot of people off, but it's also only £4.50, the same price as 140, and you could play it for ages in the hard modes, with the levels being different every time you pick it up. And it's just addictive. I always want to give it just one more try to see if I can get past the point where I got to before. Plus, the multiplayer also gives it a boost in replay value too, because you can show it to different people and play at the same time. The visuals are minimal but colourful and engaging, the controls are basic but easy to master and perfectly responsive, the music and sound design gives the game a really distinct personality, and I would say that I prefer THOTH to 140 because it's definitely got more replay value and is a bit faster paced, which I personally enjoyed. This is extremely highly recommended if you're a fan of top-down shooters or twin-stick shooters, and you're looking for something that you've not seen before in those genres. And that wraps up my thoughts on Jeppe Carlsen's games. I hear whispers that he's working on something new, so it will be exciting to see if that follows a similar style to 140 and THOTH, or whether it will be something completely different. Either way though, he's an incredibly talented creator, and he's worth keeping your eye on. Now all I can do is hope that 140 and THOTH get a physical Switch release, because it would be nice to display them on my shelf. Either way, I hope you enjoyed these videos. If you did, give them a like, Subscribe if you want to see more stuff coming soon, and I'll see you next time. Bye!